Hi, I'm Travis Pollan, and the title of this presentation is Do High Workloads Increase the Risk of Injury in College Swimmers? The overall objective for this presentation is to explore strategies to reduce swimmers' injury risk and maximize their performance through evidence-based workload monitoring and management. There are three objectives: to describe the training injury prevention paradox in swimming, to compare and contrast acute workloads and acute to chronic workload ratios for workload monitoring, and to address the merits and drawbacks of college swim teams' winter training trips. The topics covered in this talk will be most specific to swimmers, but they'll really apply to anyone who works with overhead athletes and repetitive sport athletes. Little background on me. I am a former record-holding Paralympic swimmer myself. After I retired from swimming, I turned into a rehabilitation scientist as well as an exercise scientist. And I currently teach exercise science at Thomas Jefferson University. And to contextualize my research, when I read a lot of the swimming literature, I find many studies unactionable for practitioners. So what I want to do with my research is to take my practical experience and bring it into the research to conduct research that has real-world applications. So the specific paper that I'm going to focus on in this presentation is one that was published last year in the Journal of Athletic Training called Workload and Non-Contact Musculoskeletal Injury in College Swimmers, Prospective Cohort Study. This talk will be broken into three sections. The first, I'll give some background on injury and workload, then I'll get into my research, and then I'll finish up with broader applications for athlete monitoring and load management. So we'll start with the background on injury and workloads. When we work with athletes, we have two crucial but apparently paradoxical responsibilities. We are simultaneously trying to minimize risk of injury as well as maximize performance. And in order to maximize performance, high workloads are often required. The thing is that those same high workloads are often associated with increased injury risk. This phenomenon has been described by an Australian applied sports scientist by the name of Tim Gabbett as the training injury prevention paradox. The key questions are, how do we improve an athlete's performance if the more they train, the more likely they are to get injured? And how can we enhance athletes' performance without increasing their injury risk? To answer those questions, we can start by reviewing how injuries happen. First things first, injuries are multifactorial. This is a model from 1994 by Willem Nieuwisse that illustrates the fact that there are tons of factors that can affect an athlete's injury risk. And we can break this model down and build it up bit by bit. So the model proposes that athletes have internal risk factors that predispose them to injury. Some examples of risk factors that have been studied extensively are things like age, sex, athletic experience, previous injuries, their technique or skill, different anatomical factors, their fitness, and their psychology. According to the model, these athletes with predisposing factors are then exposed to external risk factors, such as the sporting environment, the equipment that they're using. These things can make them susceptible to an injury. Finally, an injury results when an inciting event or a series of inciting events in the case of an overuse injury occurs where the biomechanical stress of the event exceeds the tolerance of the athlete's tissues. But that's not all. This risk profile is not static. As we know, athletes are dynamic, they're constantly evolving. And so to represent this constant adaptation, we can add a feedback loop to the model that represents repeat participation. So every time an athlete trains or competes, that exposure either results in the athlete getting injured or most of the time not getting injured. And when they don't get injured, they get fed back into the loop for another athletic exposure. And participation in sport produces both negative adaptations in the short term, like fatigue, and positive adaptations in the more medium term, like fitness. And this fitness and fatigue, these positive and negative adaptations, change the risk profile. So improved fitness might mean better protection from injury, from increased strength, power, endurance, but increased fatigue might mean temporarily experiencing temporary impairments to those same attributes. These relationships between training and fitness and fatigue and performance and injury risk can be modeled as shown here. The nature of the workload is what determines the degree to which fitness or fatigue dominates the athlete's response to that workload. So how, again, should sports medicine practitioners, coaches account for these relationships? How do we try to maximize fitness while being mindful of fatigue and its effects on performance and injury risk? Part of the answer to that question is monitoring athletes. Athlete monitoring is about keeping track of how much work an athlete has done, both from a training and competition standpoint. That can be measured two ways, externally and internally, which I'll talk more about in a second. We can also look at how athletes are responding or tolerating their workloads, both subjectively, how they perceive their well-being, as well as objectively from a readiness standpoint to assess how much fatigue that they're under and how ready or prepared they are for another exposure to another workload. And finally, we can look at health problems. And a good way to do this is just self-reported injury surveillance. For now, we're just going to focus on workload monitoring, and we'll come back to the perceived well-being, readiness, and health problems when we get to the applications section at the end of the talk. So we can define workload as any training or competition stimulus that an athlete undergoes. And we can measure this two ways, externally and internally. So an external workload is the absolute amount of work that an athlete performs, both from the standpoint of volume and intensity. So some ways that we can look at this would be the duration, how long they're practicing, the distance that they've covered, how many miles have they run, how fast did they run them, how many reps did they do in the weight room, what load did they use on the bar. And then we can also look at an athlete's internal workload, which is their physiological or psychological response to a given external workload. So this is important because different athletes respond to the same external workload with different internal workloads. So two athletes could run an 8-minute mile, and one could experience that as very challenging, and another could experience that as fairly easy. We can measure internal workload with heart rate, with rating of perceived exertion. One common way of doing this is an 11-point scale from 0 to 10, where 0 represents complete rest and 10 an all-out maximal effort. And the reason that I've highlighted duration and rating of perceived exertion in this table is because they're sometimes used together. They're multiplied to produce what's called a session RPE. So for example, if you had a 90-minute bout with an 8 out of 10 RPE, so a very, very hard RPE, if you multiply 90 by 8, you would get 720 exertional units. And this is thought to encapsulate the athlete's entire workload with one number. In terms of workloads, we can also look at them across various time frames. So the two most common ways of doing that are looking at acute workloads and chronic workloads. Acute workloads are the most recent workloads. These are typically measured in the short term, so over the last 7 days. And this is thought to be a proxy for the fatigue that the athlete is under. We can also look at chronic workloads, which are the workloads that athletes are accustomed to in the longer term, usually measured over the last 4 weeks. And these chronic workloads are thought to represent the athlete's fitness. And then in the last decade or so, an emerging method for quantifying workload is called the acute to chronic workload ratio, which is a ratio of the athlete's past week workload to their past month's workload. And this ratio is intended to be a proxy for the athlete's relative preparedness by comparing their short-term workload to their long-term workload. So again, we divide the previous week's workload by the previous month's. So a ratio closer to 1 would indicate that we're doing similar workloads in the 4th week compared to the rest of the month. But higher acute to chronic workload ratios would mean that the most recent training is much higher than the body is used to. To get a feel for what this data can look like, on the left, I have a 4th week of training that's just a little bit more than the other 3. So when we divide the 4th week load by the rest of the month, we get an acute to chronic workload ratio of 1.2. On the right, the 4th week of training is a lot more than the other 3. Maybe the athlete has increased their training frequency to 2-a-days, for example, or maybe they've gone home from college for Thanksgiving break, and their home team does a lot more volume than their college team, for example. So when we do the same mathematical principle on the right, we get an acute to chronic workload ratio of 1.6, which could be dangerously high because the body isn't well adapted to the demands being imposed. So basically, a high acute to chronic workload indicates a spike in recent training relative to what an athlete's accustomed to. And the thinking is that injuries are more likely to occur when workloads spike. And there is some evidence backing this idea up, although the model has received a lot of criticism in recent years. I'm not going to address those criticisms in this talk, but I'm happy for you to reach out to me and we can discuss them. So again, although the literature is conflicting, there was a 2016 review that showed associations between high acute to chronic workload ratios and injury in several sports. They looked at cricket, Australian football, and rugby. This is an illustrative plot of the risk of injury versus different acute to chronic workload ratios. And the theory is that the risk of injury is lowest with acute to chronic workload ratios in the 0.8 to 1.3 range, which has been called the sweet spot. And in this sweet spot, the thinking is that we're applying progressive overload gradually enough to allow the body to adapt. And then increased injury risk happens when the acute to chronic workload exceeds 1.5. And the researchers call that the danger zone. It just represents a sudden increase in training load. We've talked already about how high workloads improve fitness, but also increase injury risk. And the previous plot also alluded to the idea that low workloads might also increase injury risk due to poor fitness. So with workload monitoring, we are supposed to strive for that sweet spot between too little and too much, like Goldilocks. The intention is to build up to high chronic workloads for improved fitness and keep acute workloads within those moderate acute to chronic workload ratios between 0.8 and 1.3. Because swimming injuries are often due to overuse mechanisms and overuse injuries are thought to be load related, I thought that the acute to chronic workload ratio could be relevant for swimmers. Maybe they would have a different sweet spot and danger zone compared to the field and court sport athletes that had previously been studied. But prior to my and my colleagues' research, this had not been investigated in swimmers. So my research looked at workload and injury in Division III swimmers. Swimmers really epitomize this training injury prevention paradox that we talked about before. Competitive swimmers are notorious for both high workloads and overuse injuries, particularly to the shoulder. At the college level, it's been shown that swimmers log an average of about 15 miles per week in the span of about 2 hours a day, 6 days a week, and sometimes it's a lot more than that. Swimmers' shoulders are particularly susceptible to injury. In just 1 week, their shoulders can go through as many as 16,000 revolutions. And in doing so, their shoulders provide as much as 80 to 90% of the propulsion through the water. So given the high training loads and repetitive stress of the sport, it's not surprising that as many as 9 in 10 competitive swimmers report shoulder pain. What is somewhat unique about swimming is that the culture of the sport dictates that pain is a normal part of the sport. And with that being the case, that pain only causes about 3 in 10 swimmers to sit out of practice. In addition to shoulders, swimmers are also susceptible to trunk and knee injuries. Considering all swimming injuries at the college level, about 2/3 of them are the result of non-contact or overuse mechanisms. It's been theorized that overuse injuries can be boiled down to errors in workload prescription. And if that's true, then swimming injuries may be largely preventable if those errors can be identified and avoided. This brings us to the study that my colleagues and I conducted, which we published last year in the Journal of Athletic Training. The purpose of our study was to explore the extent to which high workloads were associated with injury in college swimmers. We recruited a total of 37 swimmers from one Division III swim team. So we had 16 men, 21 women. And these were experienced swimmers. They had over 10 years of experience on average, and they swam a median of 10 months out of the year. Over the course of the season, we monitored the athletes' workloads in terms of the distance that they swam each day and whether they sustained an injury. Then at the end of the season, we calculated the association between several different workload metrics and injury, which we defined as non-contact musculoskeletal pain, including acute and overuse that resulted from team activities and prevented the student athlete from participating in a competition or at least 50% of one practice. We looked at the associations between workload and injury in 4 different ways. We first looked at just overall workloads, the total distance that they swam over the course of the entire season, and correlated that with injury at any point in the season. And then we looked at different week-to-week metrics. So we looked at acute workloads over 7-day stretches, chronic workloads over 28-day stretches, and then the ratio thereof. And we looked at whether injuries occurred or coincided with those different workload metrics. To facilitate comparisons and interpretation, we dichotomized workloads based on outliers, which we called high workloads. And we compared them to all lower workloads, which we called low to moderate workloads. The demarcations for high workloads turned out to be 37 kilometers a week for acute and chronic workloads and 1.56 for the acute to chronic workload ratio, which is similar to the 1.5 danger zone previously reported from other sports. Here's what the workload data looked like for one sample study participant who sustained an injury in the 16th week of the season. We have the week of the season on the horizontal axis and the acute workload for each week on the vertical axis. Now I've overlaid the acute to chronic workload ratio in black, as well as a dashed blue line demarcating high acute workloads, those over 37 kilometers, and a dashed black line demarcating high acute to chronic workload ratios, those over 1.56. As you can see, in week 16, the team took their annual winter training trip to Puerto Rico, where they did 2 practices per day for about 10 days. This is supposed to be a high workload shock to the system that prepares them to then taper for their championship meet 6 weeks later. That training trip came right after finals in weeks 12 and 13 and winter break in weeks 14 and 15, which are known to be periods of reduced workloads for many student athletes, including this one. This particular student athlete also had the flu for the week before all that, hence the big spike up to almost 2 in their acute to chronic workload ratio, and perhaps not surprisingly, they also got injured that 16th week. Out of all 37 swimmers, 11 of them, or about 30%, sustained an injury over the course of the season. The injured body regions were as we expected. There were 7 shoulder injuries, 3 trunk injuries, and 1 knee injury. Almost all of the injuries were overuse mechanisms, and the onset of about a third of them was the first 5 weeks of the season, and then the onset for the remaining 2/3 were during the week 16 winter training trip or shortly thereafter. Most of the injuries were not severe. The median number of days affected was just 2, and only 3 of the 11 injuries had more than 4 days affected. In terms of the statistical associations between workloads and injuries, we found no significant association between overall workload, the distance that the swimmers swam throughout the season, and injury. There was also no association between chronic workloads and injury. The bars of this plot show all of the chronic workloads for every week of every athlete's season. So that's a total of 809 athlete weeks, arranged from smallest 0% to largest 100%. High chronic workloads were those above this dashed line at 37 kilometers per week. And as you can see, injuries occurred at the red bars, which are relatively evenly spread throughout workloads. As a result, there was no significant association between high chronic workloads and injury. This is the same plot now for acute workloads. As you can see, the injuries tended to cluster towards the right side of the plot, where workloads were high and above that 37-kilometer demarcation. This relationship was statistically significant, and the odds of injury were 27 times higher during high acute workload weeks compared to low to moderate workload weeks. This is the same plot now for the acute to chronic workload ratio. And again, odds of injury were 25 times higher during high acute to chronic workload ratio weeks compared to low to moderate acute to chronic workload ratio weeks. Here's another way of visualizing the data. On the horizontal axes, we have workloads, and on the vertical axis, we have injury rates. In both cases, when acute workloads were high over 37 kilometers and acute to chronic workload ratios were high over 1.56, injury rates increased by an order of magnitude, from less than or equal to 1% for all lower ranges to 15% and 14% respectively for the high acute workloads and high acute to chronic workload ratios. And as you can see, there's no clear advantage to using the acute workloads or the acute to chronic workload ratios. To illustrate the comparison between the acute workload and the acute to chronic workload further, or the acute to chronic workload ratio further, let's look at a few weeks of the athlete's season in particular with high workloads, but not high acute to chronic workload ratios. Those will be in blue. These would be indicative that the athlete was well prepared for a high acute workload. Then we can look at weeks with high acute to chronic workload ratios, but not high acute workloads, which we'll color gold. These would be weeks where athletes were ill prepared, but they did not have a high acute workload. And then finally, we can look at weeks where athletes experienced both high acute workloads and high acute to chronic workload ratios. We'll color these brownish green. These we could interpret as weeks where athletes were ill prepared for high acute workloads. On this slide, I'm showing the 37 participants in the study along the horizontal axis and the 22 weeks of the season along the vertical axis. Weeks that were high acute workloads are shaded blue. Weeks that were high acute to chronic workload ratios are shaded gold. And weeks that were both high acute workload and high acute to chronic workload ratio are brownish green. And then weeks where athletes sustained injuries are in red. We had 4 injuries early in the season, and then 7 injuries during the week 16 training trip, during which every swimmer on the trip spiked their acute workload, their acute to chronic workload ratio, or both. And all of the injuries during week 16 occurred during both high acute and high acute to chronic workload ratio weeks, those brownish green shadings. None of the other injuries in weeks 1 through 5 or 18 were high acute or high acute to chronic workload ratio. This is why the associations were so similar between injury and acute workload and injury and acute to chronic workload ratio. So what does this all mean? Well, for weeks that athletes experienced high acute workloads only, there were 14 instances and no injuries. And we can interpret that as high chronic workloads potentially protecting against injury, which would favor the use of acute to chronic workload ratios. However, there were also 17 weeks where athletes experienced high acute to chronic workload ratios alone and no injuries. And we could interpret this as being high acute to chronic workload ratios are not a problem if acute workloads aren't high, which would then favor just using acute workloads. But then we also had 32 weeks where both acute workloads and acute to chronic workload ratios were high. And during those 32 weeks, there were 7 injuries. And we can interpret that as high acute to chronic workload ratios are a problem when acute workloads are also high, which would favor the use of looking at both acute workloads and acute to chronic workload ratios. So if we're thinking about whether to use acute workloads, acute to chronic workload ratios, or both when monitoring swimmers, We could just use acute workload because it's simpler. There's no division involved, but it doesn't account for the potential protective effect of high chronic workloads. So we could use acute to chronic workload ratio, which would account for chronic workloads, which may protect against injury. Or we could use both. And we had 32 weeks where we had both high acute workloads and high acute to chronic workload ratios. And 7 of those 32 weeks, we saw injuries, which is 22%. And we saw no injuries during the 31 athlete weeks with just high acute workloads or just high acute to chronic workload ratios. So this would favor using a combination of both. However, it's important to note that 32 weeks out of 809 is only 4% of this data set. This is a small sample size. So we have to be careful when we're interpreting these findings because our sample size of 37 people led to very wide confidence intervals for the odds ratios for acute workloads and high acute to chronic workload ratios. So the magnitudes of those associations that I mentioned, 25 times higher odds of injury, 27 times higher odds of injury in the presence of those high workloads, those magnitudes should be interpreted with caution. This small sample size is just the reality of conducting research on one team in one season. We need future studies to replicate this work in a larger cohort of swimmers over multiple teams or multiple seasons or both. In particular, we need future studies to validate the demarcations that we found for high workloads from this study of 37 kilometers for the week and an acute to chronic workload ratio of 1.56. So for now, we should be careful not to generalize those demarcations, especially to swimmers with very different workloads or training patterns from the swimmers in this study. So just a summary here of the odds ratios for each of the different workload metrics and their associations with injury. Here are some practical takeaways for sports medicine practitioners and coaches with regards to workload and swimmers. So when we're looking at overall workloads and chronic workloads, we found that swimmers can tolerate high overall and high chronic workloads without increased injury odds. This is great news because it means that as long as these high workloads are spread out relatively evenly throughout the course of the season, athletes are able to perform those workloads without increased injury. We found these demarcations for high acute workloads and high acute to chronic workload ratios, 37 kilometers per week and a ratio of acute to chronic workload of 1.56. Again, we need more data to validate these demarcations, and we need more data to determine whether to use acute workload, acute to chronic workload ratio, or both. But at this point, I would encourage practitioners not to treat these values of 37 kilometers per week or 1.56 for the acute to chronic workload ratio as lines in the sand that they should never cross. Practitioners should consider each student athlete on an individual basis based on how they've historically tolerated workloads and their current well-being and readiness, which I'll talk more about in a minute. The last piece of this is the winter training trip. So it's swimming tradition that training trip provides a high workload shock that helps prepare athletes for their championship meet. The challenge is that this training trip often comes right after finals and winter break, which again are periods of reduced workloads for many student athletes. So what we can do is we can educate swimmers here. We can explain to them why it's important to maintain a minimum workload over finals and over winter break. And we can help them come up with cross-training strategies if they don't have access to a pool while they're home, for example. In our study, 7 swimmers reported interfering pain during the winter training trip, or about 1 in 5 of the swimmers. The good news is that 5 out of those 7 injuries resolved before the trip was over, but 2 did linger for about 2 weeks before those student athletes eventually returned to full participation. All of this goes back to the training injury prevention paradox. Practitioners should very carefully weigh the injury risk versus the performance reward. On the one hand, They can approach this from a risk mitigation standpoint. And for athletes who've previously sustained workload-related injuries, maybe that means prescribing them lower workloads and having them do more cross-training during the training trip, which I think happens to a large extent already in the real world. Another option would be to do a slower ramp up instead of a sudden shock of high volume training, especially for student athletes who were less active over the break period. The alternative to risk mitigation would be risk acceptance, which would be tolerating the increased risk, which we saw in my study to be mostly minor injuries, tolerating that increased risk in exchange for the performance boost that the athletes will encounter. And that's okay as long as it's an informed decision that the athletes, coaches, and sports medicine team are all making. Again, whether it's winter training trip or any other time point in the season, this shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all approach. We should treat every athlete on an individual basis and consider their workload within the broader context of their overall risk profile. Again, looking at their intrinsic risk factors, their age, their previous injuries, their technique, fitness, experience, level of play, as well as their perceived well-being, which I'll talk more about momentarily. But this would encapsulate things like the physiological stressors that they're encountering outside the sport. Maybe they're traveling, maybe they're nutritionally deficient, maybe they're lacking sleep. And it could encapsulate psychological stressors as well, academic demands, interpersonal relationships, and so on. All of these things can impact an athlete's risk and should be considered when we're prescribing and managing their loads. Okay, so now onto the broader applications for athlete monitoring and load management for both swimmers as well as other athletes, whether they're healthy, rehabbing, or in the return to sport period. So we can look at these paradigms across three different levels of prevention, starting with primary prevention, so prevention of the first injury, secondary prevention, where an injury has occurred already and we're trying to prevent it from getting worse, or tertiary prevention, where the injury has occurred and now we're trying to prevent future injuries. So secondary and tertiary prevention would fall in more to the realms of rehab, return to sport, and re-injury prevention. So we can implement load monitoring and management at every level. And when we're thinking about primary prevention, we can focus on the workload part of athlete monitoring. Again, for swimmers, this could be as simple as logging the distance that they swam each day of the season. And if we wanted to, we could calculate the acute to chronic workload ratio, or we can keep it simple and just monitor their acute workload, as I'm showing here, using a 7-day average. And we can be cautious about potentially avoiding training above what might be the danger zone of 37 kilometers or 40,000 yards in 1 week. External workloads, or the yardage that the athlete swims, is only 1/2 of the workload equation, though. External workloads don't capture the athlete's internal response to that workload. Some athletes might experience a given yardage as relatively low stress, others might experience it as extremely stressful. So 2 ways to capture internal workloads would be heart rate, which would be a higher tech option, and rating of perceived exertion, which would be a lower tech option. There are actually, there's new technology that's come out in recent years for heart rate monitoring technology that fits into the athlete's goggles. And for the low price of $250, that could be yours. I would love to see future studies include that technology. Unfortunately, I don't have the budget for it. But ideally, we're considering the external and internal workloads together, because a high external workload might be low risk if it's characterized by a low internal workload that's not creating a lot of fatigue. But a low external workload with a high internal workload could be a signal that the athlete is under-recovered. Beyond just workload, we can also monitor how an athlete is responding to or tolerating that workload, both subjectively from a perceived well-being standpoint, taking into account psychological stressors as well, and objectively from a readiness standpoint, as a proxy for the amount of fatigue that they're under to see if they're ready or prepared for a repeat exposure to another workload. From a perceived well-being standpoint, the question that we're trying to answer is how well is the athlete tolerating this workload? So this can encapsulate psychological measures like stress, recovery, mood. And I think we intuitively do this on a daily basis when we ask athletes how they're doing, right? But these are more systematic or quantitative approaches. Two in particular that I like are daily self-reported wellness questionnaires. One of them is called the Total Quality of Recovery Scale, which is about tallying up recovery points for things like nutrition, hydration, sleep, relaxation, emotional support, and stress. And then there's also the Hooper scale, which is a popular scale that looks at sleep, stress, fatigue, and muscle soreness, and asks athletes to rate those on a 1 through 5 or 1 through 7 scale each day. We can also look at readiness, again, a proxy for the amount of fatigue that the athlete's under, and we can do this several different ways. All of these ways are designed to answer the question of, is the athlete ready or prepared for another training stimulus or a subsequent workload? So we can measure their strength, their power, their aerobic fitness. We can take a biochemical measure. With all these things, we just want to make sure that we're not overly taxing or burdening the athlete. So we might do something like a short burst, 3 to 6 seconds on a cycling ergometer, and see what their max power output is. We could do a sub-max aerobic test. We could look at their heart rate. We could take blood. All of these things are just designed to assess the athlete's readiness to go and train and compete. And when we're assessing these responses to workloads, what we're really doing is engaging in that secondary level of prevention. We're looking for existing subclinical injuries and then trying to prevent them from worsening. As I mentioned before, an athlete's risk profile is not static. These risk factors are constantly being modified by fitness and fatigue adaptations to previously imposed workloads. All of this suggests the importance of regularly and repeatedly testing athletes throughout the season for their readiness to train and compete and for their perceived well-being. This could be every day, it could be once a week, really as often or realistic as possible. And rather than just looking for poor performance on some of these metrics compared to some normative value, we can look for large deviations within a person from their normal response. And we can use a traffic light system. So for example, if an athlete has a minimal deviation from normal, let's say it's less than 15% or less than 1 or 2 standard deviations from their normal response, then they're good to go train and compete. Green light. If an athlete has a large deviation from normal, greater than, let's say, 15% or more than 1 or 2 standard deviations, that's a yellow light. We could measure them again later in the day, and if the value is back to normal, they can go and train and compete. But if the value measures low a second time, then we take them into further testing. We send them to the athletic trainer, send them to the physician, and we decide whether they're actually injured and they need to go into the secondary prevention level, or they're not injured and we just need to manage their loads. So for example, if we had planned high-speed training, sprinting, explosive work in that day's practice, we could back off in some way, manage their loads to make sure that we're not subjecting them to something that they're not going to handle well that day. And then finally, we can look at these concepts from a tertiary prevention standpoint. So the athlete is already injured. Now we're trying to prevent future injury, trying to make sure that we're returning them to sport safely. So the keys here during rehabilitation and return to sport are to avoid losing fitness. We want to make sure that they're maintaining some minimum workload throughout rehab. For example, if they've broken a finger, we don't need to or want to lose all fitness just because of that broken finger. There's still so much that they can do. And then for example, if they have an upper extremity injury, they could kick in the pool. If they have a lower extremity injury, they could pull in the pool. And then when we're getting ready to return them back to sport, we want to make sure that we're not just throwing them back into full participation after doing very little during rehab. And I think this happens a lot of the time with swimmers. They hurt, then they rest, then they feel better, and then they just go right back to doing the previous training volume that they were doing. And then they hurt again, and the cycle repeats. So what we want to do is gradually increase their workloads to pre-injury levels throughout that return to sport continuum, from return to modified participation or practice to return to sport to return to performance. And in order to do this, we need to make sure that we are objectively quantifying and monitoring those workloads. Last but not least, from a monitoring standpoint, we can look at health problems. And one of the best ways to do this is to have the athletes report them directly to us as sports medicine practitioners or coaches. Most of the time, injury surveillance focuses on time loss injuries or relies on athletes going to the training room or seeking medical help. What happens, especially with a sport like swimming, is that this underestimates the impact of injuries, especially overuse injuries that don't cause the athlete to sit out or cause them to go see sports medicine. So the alternative is a weekly questionnaire. An example of this is the Oslo Sports Trauma Research Center questionnaire on health problems. They define a health problem as any injury, illness, pain, or mental health condition causing a reduction in the athlete's normal state of health. So they'll ask the athlete, during the past 7 days, have you had any health problems that affected participation in training or competition, or that caused you to modify training or competition, or that affected your performance, or that caused you pain during your sport? And the goal is to identify health problems that are not causing time loss and that might fly under the radar of the medical team, so that we can prevent these minor injuries from progressing and becoming more serious ones. So the idea here is to flag athletes with non-time loss complaints to open up the lines of communication between the player, the coach, and the medical team. So if I were to design a sample monitoring program for swimmers across all of these different constructs, it would look like this. From an external workload standpoint, I would track the distance that they swam each day, as well as their average swim speed if I could get it. I would also look at their internal workload. Session rating of perceived exertion would be a cheap option. Heart rate monitoring would be a higher tech option. And I would look at those across every training session. Every morning when the athlete woke up, I would ask them to fill out the Hooper scale on a Google form on their phone. And then every day, I would also ask them to take their resting heart rate in the morning or heart rate variability, which you can do right on your smartphone. There are apps for it when you wake up. And then when they came into practice, I might measure either their grip strength, or I could do an IYT shoulder strength test before training. And then on a weekly basis, I would look at health problems with that questionnaire that I just showed. So a lot of this you can apply directly to other upper extremity dominant athletes, or you could substitute some of the workload metrics in swimming for, say, GPS data, and you could replace upper extremity strength and function measures with lower extremity ones for other sports. In general, when it comes to load management, what we want to do is make sure that we're building up workloads gradually and establishing a moderate workload and maintaining a minimum workload. What we don't want to do is impose excessive workloads or suddenly increase workloads drastically from 1 week to the next. And oftentimes we see that happening in the preseason or with swim teams during training trip, where we're prone to these sudden increases. We also want to watch out for low external workloads and high internal workloads, as well as low workloads with low perceived well-being or readiness. Low perceived well-being or readiness are red flags alone, but they might be explained, at least in part, by a high workload. But if the workload is low, then something else might be going on, like something stressful in the athlete's life, inadequate physical preparation, insufficient recovery. And then last but not least, we want to look at those current health problems. And remember that all of the monitoring and load management that I've talked about in this presentation is just one part of a comprehensive injury prevention program that could also include warm-up and exercise, recovery strategies, psychological interventions, and environmental control. I'm not going to go into this in depth, but here's a warm-up program that I designed for swimmers. You can scan the QR code and it'll take you to a YouTube playlist of all of the exercises. So it includes a light aerobic warm-up, followed by some flexibility and mobility, locomotion, core exercises, and some plyometrics and power. So this would be a great warm-up that swimmers could use before practice. I could also see it being used for other overhead sports as well. Also here, I have a testing battery that I would give athletes, swimmers in particular, in the preseason, and as well as maybe the mid-season. So, and then you could take a couple of the measures and monitor them more frequently. I mentioned grip strength and IYT strength before. I also have some good questionnaires that would be helpful to administer in the preseason. And again, here, there's a YouTube playlist at the QR code that you can look at all the videos of the physical performance tests in case you're not familiar with them. The key to all of this is really effective communication and collaboration with the athlete, the coach, and the rest of the sports medicine team. This can't be done by one practitioner. For example, our data showed that most injuries occurred at the beginning of the season and during training trip. So prior to the season and prior to the training trip, this would be a great time for the athletic trainers, the strength and conditioning coach, the sport coach to all huddle up and conduct preseason and mid-season testing on range of motion, strength, power, stability, core. Try to identify athletes with red flags on those measures, identify athletes who need to see the physician, and try to prevent those minor problems from becoming major ones. So we can collaborate all together, sports medicine, coaches, athletes, demonstrate from a sports medicine side that sports medicine understands the importance of high workloads in swimming. Because if the athlete or coach thinks that the athletic trainer is automatically, if the athlete goes to the athletic trainer, they're automatically going to remove them from participation, then they're not going to go to the athletic trainer. So we need to work together to come up with load management alternatives that work for swimmers, besides just sitting out entirely. So we could work to come up with a solution where we're just modifying the intensity or the volume, but not both. We could temporarily reduce yardage for strokes that are causing pain and increase the yardage of non-pain provoking strokes. We could temporarily modify equipment usage, if that's paddles, fins, parachutes, whatever. We could increase recovery strategies. So help the athletes with their sleep, nutrition, relaxation, cold plunges, stretching, active recovery, whatever your favorite recovery strategy is. We could increase the athlete's overall robustness with dryland training, especially in the off season. And for athletes who aren't tolerating high workloads well, maybe getting them in the pool, maybe getting them out of the pool for more of that outside the pool training. So to recap, swimmers epitomize this training injury prevention paradox, where high workloads maximize their fitness, but also increase their injury risk. The acute to chronic workload ratio has been thought to solve this paradox by comparing the past month or the past week to the past month. It gives you an idea of the athlete's relative preparedness to a given load. And the sweet spot for that is thought to be 0.8 to 1.3, where we can maximize fitness while decreasing injury risk. In my study on Division III swimmers, in my small sample, I found that we definitely need more data to endorse the acute to chronic workload ratio or the acute workload alone. But high workloads were associated with injury. And so practitioners should carefully weigh risk versus reward, especially when it comes to high workload training trips. And from my data, it seems like using both the acute workload and the acute to chronic workload ratio is the most effective. From a monitoring and management standpoint, we want to monitor athletes for physiological and psychological signs and symptoms of fatigue and under recovery using both objective and subjective measures so that we can manage loads accordingly. I would like to thank my collaborators on my research, as well as the swim team, coaches, and student athletes, my alma mater, Drexel University, and my current place of employment, Thomas Jefferson University. Here are the references that I cited throughout the presentation, and I would be happy to engage through email, through the contact form on my website, through social media. If you have any questions, I would be delighted to hear from you to discuss these topics further. Last but not least, I do have an extra slide here on some of the criticisms that the acute to chronic workload ratio has gotten. So if any of these you'd like to talk about, I'd be more than happy to talk about them as well. So thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to hearing from you.